Next from Chicago, we sit down with the president and CEO of the Illinois Chamber of Commerce, Doug Whitley. Mr. Whitley, who is retiring from the Chamber of Commerce at the end of June, discusses some of the major issues affecting Illinois business, how to improve Illinois' business climate, and whether Illinois is at a competitive disadvantage financially with its neighboring states. This runs about 35 minutes.
Doug Whitley, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
My pleasure to visit with you.
It's been a while since we talked, and thought we'd want to catch up on some of the major issues that are facing Illinois business. Everyone knows we hear so much about the state's troubles, the state government, but the state gets its money from the economy of Illinois. So let's talk about Illinois business, both large and small. What are some of the major issues that you've been working on in the past year?
Well, the biggest issues at the state level are getting the state's fiscal house in order, and obviously what has been for some time the elephant in the room is public employee pensions. Good news is that the General Assembly took action in December, although it's still going to be litigated. It was a very substantial move on the part of the General Assembly. The bad news of that is that that's only one step in a series of hurdles that the General Assembly and local government officials are going to have to undertake as we are taping this. You know, Mayor Rahm Emanuel has recently announced a pension program proposal that he's negotiated with 2 of his 5 union pension programs, and so additional action needs to be taken by both the City Council and the Illinois General Assembly. So getting your fiscal house in order is number one. Number 2 is unemployment. I am constantly amazed at how our elected officials have ignored high unemployment in the state of Illinois. It's just totally unacceptable to have unemployment. It's the 3rd highest unemployment rate in the country. And you would think that it was non-existent as an issue. I think this is fundamental and it needs to be driven home extremely hard. Because if we have more people working and we've got more jobs, we've got people taking care of themselves and less reliance upon government, and that will help to a great extent resolve some of the state's fiscal issues that I talked about as being the number 1 issue. Third, I think, is education. We clearly have, I believe, miscommunications or a lack of communications between employers and the education community, and I think we need to put a lot more attention on the product that's coming out of our educational institutions at multiple levels so that they are job ready and have good skills. And then, sure.
Well, just on that, I wanted to not, let's stop on that, because the thing is, so I just heard the other day, and I think this is what you're alluding to,
Right.
People were testifying before the House Education Committee and saying that so many of the people that are coming out of the schools just are not job ready. They don't have the level of education that they should be having, having been a high school graduate.
Yeah.
Is that what you're...
Job readiness is part of it relative to the high schools, but it's also true at the community college level and 4-year institutions that more communication needs to be underway.
Are they studying the wrong things? Are they not educated enough?
It goes both ways. Partly is that the employers don't spend enough time telling the educators what they need and want and what they expect. And the other one is educators have long had the tradition that, of course, we're generating a well-educated, informed, well-rounded individual, regardless of whether or not that person has skills. And then, of course, the big black hole here is the dropout rate. We have so many young people who are no longer in the system, and if you're not a productive member of society, then you're a drain on society. So it's in our interest to make sure that every citizen in the state of Illinois who can possibly be prepared to be employed should do so. Now, what employers tell me is, number 1, they've got problems with literacy and basic math skills and such. Number 2, serious problems with drug testing. Many of their applicants can't pass drug tests. And number 3, quite frankly, is an old issue, but that's a willingness and a desire to work. Employers tell me all the time they have jobs going begging, and they just can't find people who want to work, in part because society has supported them in such a way that working is not the motivating influence in their lives. So there are a lot of issues related to what I call a workforce.
And obviously, when we're looking at state spending, I mean, anytime, as you just mentioned, if we put someone to work, if they're not working, they're probably getting some benefits from the state, and that's going to be a drain on taxes as
Right.
compared to paying taxes if they're working.
You know, it's so important that we talk about productivity and we talk about quality of the workforce. I can recall as a young person growing up, we always talked about the work ethic of the greater Midwest and that farmers' work ethic and all the industrial Midwest commitment to work. And yet, when I talk to employers today, they don't see that same commitment to work ethic that existed a generation or two ago, particularly a concern about younger people. So there are definite issues that have to be overcome. None of this can be taken for granted.
Let's talk about the state and how the state intersects with what is happening with Illinois business in,
Right.
in a variety of ways.
Right.
Everyone knows that the state's fiscal house, as you said, is in bad shape. To what extent, I presume, well, let me just ask, do you get involved in trying to bring businesses into the state of Illinois?
Occasionally. For example, I took a phone call not so long ago from a woman who was trying to locate a Canadian facility, and she had come to the conclusion that her recommendation to her executives is that Chicago is where that facility ought to go. And the phone call to me went something like this. I want to recommend that we locate this new U.S. Site in Chicago. I know that I'm going to get significant pushback from my superiors. Help me build the case for why it ought to be in Chicago. And I think that's part of our challenge right now. The self-image of the state of Illinois is such that many decision makers are choosing not to even entertain Chicago, and a lot of it comes down to our bad fiscal policies, our anti-business rhetoric that we've heard for so many years, our debt obligations, and a couple of things, public relations, you know, sending people to prison, all the public officials to prison with some degree of frequency does not sit well, because you think, well, in Illinois there's a lot of corruption, and I don't want to be in a corrupt state if I can be in a state where that's not likely to be as apparent. So our image is very important. The other elements that I think that comes into play is what I call confidence and trust. And I think our elected officials for the last decade or more have tarnished that element of confidence and trust. And if you don't have confidence and trust in government, and by the way, the Chicago Tribune just had a story in Sunday's paper where there was a poll that showed that trust was a big issue. Illinois came in 50th in the people's trust in their state government. Well, that is something that's hard to recover from. And yet that's exactly what faces our elected officials in Illinois. They've got to reestablish trust and confidence with decision makers, with voters, with taxpayers, and particularly with the business community. So I think that's part of what we have to deal with.
Yeah, in fact, the Paul Simon Institute just had a poll out, and one of the things that they polled was that issue of trust in government.
Right.
And in Illinois, only 26% trusted government to do the right thing.
Right.
By comparison, they said that Texas, it's 72%.
Right.
So again, when we're competing for jobs, and that's why I was asking
Right.
to what extent, what do you hear from these other people, as
Right.
you mentioned, and how important that is, not just to turn the economy of Illinois around internally, but when we're trying to attract new jobs and new businesses.
Right. So what investors and business owners and managers and executives look to is for government to be operated to the greatest extent possible in the same kind of manner in which they would deal with their decision making. I mean, let's face it, management's hard. And balancing budgets and working with people is a hard exercise. And the private sector employers understand that. They do it every day. So they are not just put off, but offended when elected officials don't step up and assume the responsibility to operate with balanced budgets, pay their bills on time, make contributions to public employee pensions that are clearly due. They're looking for those kinds of signs that management, quality of management, commitment is going to be followed through. And in Illinois, I'm going to say, I think over the last 3 years, we've seen some progress. But over the last 12 years, we've had a downward spiral. And I think that after year of sending the wrong signals, it's much harder to send the right signals that we've actually gotten control of our situation. So, just a couple of examples. Even though we did the public employee pension law change in December, which was huge, it really was a huge undertaking, we still have multiple local government pension issues that still have to be dealt with. We still have an unbalanced budget. We still have bills that are outstanding and overdue to vendors. So people who are operating in Illinois said, you know, I would feel a lot more confident about this state if they were operating and managing their state governments and frankly their local governments as we in the private sector would do. Now granted, there's a huge difference between a publicly elected democratic process where consensus building is very important as opposed to being a dictator for the day, and if the CEO of a company doesn't like performance, they fire their leaders and they get new people who will deliver. Government doesn't quite work that smoothly. It's a much more painful and deliberative process, and consequently not as prompt to react to the issues that are before them.
You know, this is the thing, I was just talking to somebody, and so many times people look at, when they talk about public policy and politics, they always look at it through the prism of, are you a Republican or a Democrat? And I try to I said, you know, partisanship has its role,
right,
but so many of these issues are not partisan issues. And to that end, I mean, you know, you entertained the idea of running for governor in the past. So, I mean, you're, I think it's safe to say, Republican. On the other hand, in Chicago, you're going to have to deal all the time with people who are Democrats. So,
sure.
How much commonality is it, and to what extent does partisanship become a factor or not when you're trying to talk to people and say, this is what we need to do to help Illinois business grow?
Yeah, you know, Terry, my whole career has been in the realm of public policy, and I've had a government job, I've had nonprofit jobs, I worked in the private sector, but always close to government public policy. The greatest frustration, even now, is the sense of the distinction between what I'll call political games and responsible governing. And they get in the way of each other. And I see it all the time. You'd like to see much more collaborative effort. You'd like to see a lot more cooperation. But the people who are in power oftentimes sit on the minority party and say, well, you know, we really don't need you and we don't want you, and we're going to call the shots or play the tune because we're the ones that were elected to the majority. So the minority party has less invested in trying to help the majority party govern, and therefore the sentiment tends to be the partisanship or the gamesmanship. I mean, there's a great deal of gamesmanship and posturing that goes on, all of which hurts a government that's actually trying to demonstrate that they are efficient and well managed and paying attention. So. Case in point, our neighbor to the east, Indiana, had a Democrat governor who I thought began the tone of pro-business and turning his state around, and then he was succeeded by a Republican governor who had the same kind of philosophy, and didn't matter which party was in power, they were both trying to make changes that were positive for their state long term. I don't see as much of that cohesiveness in Illinois government, again, because of the posturing and the one-upsmanship and the power that goes with being in the majority.
Do you ever have a chance to talk to political leaders about that very point, and to what extent do they listen to you? I
do all the time, and every time I get a chance to get people to get to a, shall we say, a more rational, conversational level, I try to discuss it because I think it's one of the fundamental elements in trying to improve Illinois' business climate and, frankly, trying to improve Illinois' government. So there are certain themes that I think work. One of them is education, another one is transportation. We don't have Democrat roads and Republican bridges.
Right.
You know, it's in the best interest of the state. So investing in our infrastructure, which is one of the cornerstones of our state's economy, should not be a partisan issue. It should be a collective that we are all benefiting from that kind of investment. Yet, where the politics comes into play, or the gamesmanship comes into play, is no one wants, or few people want to step up and take responsibility for actually financing the government. They like the work, they don't want to pay the revenues, whether it be taxes or fees, necessary to sustain the investment that we have in the state. So it's a finesse game. I want the other party to look bad. I'll be glad to stand up and cut the ribbon, but let that responsibility rest on somebody else so that I can undercut them in the election cycle. That's what we need to get over on some of these really important fundamental issues for our state.
Ostensibly, I guess, I mean, there was probably a majority issue. Well, the chamber's a nonprofit, or nonpartisan.
Correct.
Right.
We support Democrats and Republicans. We do endorse candidates. We do make contributions to both parties.
What about, I was going to ask about tax policy. So right now we have any number of, seems like every day there's some different
Right.
aspect. You got the fair tax, which is a progressive income tax. You have the proposal to let what was called the partial income tax increase go down.
Right,
you
right.
have Speaker Madigan floating a millionaire tax. Do you have does the chamber take a position on those taxes, and to what extent, what would you like to see happen vis-a-vis tax policy in Illinois to encourage more entrepreneurship and creation of jobs?
Okay. Well, let's start by the recognition that there's probably more major tax law options and conversation going on this year in the spring of 2014 than I have seen in many, many years. Lots of new initiatives. I think some of that will sort out. I hope some of that sorts out. Certainly we're opposed to the progressive tax proposals that are out there. I've made comments in the past that what business would like to see is stability and predictability. Business owners, by and large, make business plans that are long-term, multi-year commitments. If I'm investing millions of dollars in a facility, I'd like to have a sense that the state is going to be a partner for the long term. And yet the messages that we constantly get out of Springfield is kind of I'll call it gotcha politics. You can't count on them because sometimes there'll be a tax credit that's going to expire and then it's reinstated and then it's allowed to expire again. So the lack of predictability is one. The other one is temporary taxes. You're far better off putting the tax in place rather than calling it a temporary tax. If you want to back off of it, back off. But when you say it's going to have a deadline, then you're creating more uncertainty. How do you plan for that situation?
Which everyone knows, by
right.
the way, was going to face a political challenge of extending it.
Correct.
You knew that when it was passed.
So, for example, I testified against the corporate income tax increase back in 2011, and I sat there in the Senate Revenue Committee or Executive Committee, whichever one it was, and I looked at the senators and I said, look, if you want to raise these taxes, I can't stop you. But my guidance to you is do not raise the corporate income tax rate in Illinois to any level that's higher than the corporate income tax rate in Indiana. We're in a competitive business, and you've got to have a tax system that's competitive. So I would sit here today and say I'd like to see the corporate income tax rate in Illinois rolled back. Right now we have the third highest rate in the country. Indiana and New York, and I believe Ohio, have all just reduced their corporate tax rates. And we need to be sensitized to that competitive environment across the state lines.
Can I interject? Some people would argue, and you've heard this before,
Right.
that really doesn't matter too much if Indiana and that these businesses aren't going to leave. I mean, you feel it does matter, and what kind of a feedback do you, I mean, it's not Doug Whitley making this
Right.
up. The point you're here because you talk to the business leaders all
Right.
the time.
It-
What are they telling you about the competitive policies?
Right now, Illinois is not as competitive in certain areas, taxation being one of those. But again, back to this point about stability and predictability and confidence and trust, those are elements that I think most employers want. The biggest issue I think that you've got to have is once a state continues to send the signal that we're not your friend, then the business investor or owner says, well, let me be where somebody does want to be my friend, where someone wants me to be successful, wants me to prosper. And so Illinois has been sending the wrong signal for too long. I think we're beginning, I mean, I really do believe we're at a tipping point in Illinois. I think as I've observed over the last 3 years, I think the Democrat majority in the General Assembly and the governor have begun to swing that pendulum back to more towards the center. Certainly, as opposed to the Blagojevich years, which were very bad years for us. But now I see some moderation going on. The problem is, it's all incremental. It's not bold enough or significant enough or strong enough for people to one, recognize it as gains and to see significant benefit from it. So incrementalism is not where we need to be. We need some bold action that demonstrates that Illinois is in a different mindset and a different mode than we've been in the past. And I concede that's hard to do, and the majority party in the governor's office must be leaders in that subject matter, or we're going to see, as I think we're already seeing, people from Illinois who have the opportunity and have the option to make decisions to leave our state. We've already had hundreds of thousands of people leave Illinois, and I think in the current environment we now have millionaires beginning to think about their future tax planning. We should not be encouraging the flight of capital, whether it's corporate business capital or whether it's individual capital. And so we need to be more sensitized to the messages that we're sending to the good citizens of Illinois about this is a great place to live, this is a great place to do business, it's a great place to be prosperous and successful. And our government needs to be a partner, not an opponent. Our government needs to give a hand up. And I don't think we've seen enough of that in the past.
Yeah, I was going to say, you recently wrote an article that Senate President Cullerton mentioned.
Right.
Basically laying out, we hear so much of the bad part of Illinois.
Right.
What are some of the good parts? And we have a lot going for the state. What are some of the things that jump out to you and why it's a good place to live and work?
Well, I thought it was very important to talk about the positives of Illinois, because it's easy to always look at the dark side of the agenda or the issues that we have to confront every day. But the bottom line is that this is a great state based in the heartland of the nation, the ability to market anywhere between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains in a single day. The place where all the interstate, we have more interstate highways than any other state. We have that cross or feed our state. All the railroads come together here, the water services, so we can use the Great Lakes or we can get out the Gulf of Mexico. Transportation is very fundamental. The pipelines that converge here, meaning that we've got low-cost energy in Illinois, both electricity and gas, and access to that. We obviously have some of the richest farmland in the world. We have great coal deposits. We have many industries that are extremely successful. We're not dependent upon a single industry. We've got diversity. It's the third largest metropolitan area in the country. Consequently, if you want to retail or market, this is the place to be. O'Hare Airport is a true asset, a gem, because you can get to anywhere in the world on basically one flight. So Chicago is the gateway to the world. Chicago is an international city. And the state of Illinois is increasingly, in fact has long been, but is increasingly truly an international market. About 18% of our state gross product is international trade. We trade significantly with Canada and Mexico, the European Union being third after that. So there's lots of reasons to be excited about what goes on in the state of Illinois. I happen to think that our Illinois business community is doing well despite our government. If we actually had a government that was in sync with us, there'd be no stopping the state of Illinois. That's why I think all those little fundamental points I talked about earlier, stability, predictability, balanced budgets, reliability, credibility.
And looking to work with business as compared to beating them.
Correct.
In fact, I would point out for the viewers that I was just told the other day by someone in the Ambassador Corps that Illinois has something like 80 consulates, that we have more foreign government
presence,
presence is the word I was looking for, thank you, than any other city in the United States outside of Washington, D.C.
And New York. where the United Nations is located.
Well, yeah, but I wasn't counting that. You're right. But
So we'll give those two East Coast cities the option. But Chicago is the capital of the Midwest. Chicago is the place that people want to come to throughout the Midwest. It's a great attraction not only for visitors and for conventions, but also young people looking for a major city to move to. Chicago is the magnet, if you will, for that urban environment if you don't want to be in the Big Apple or you get the draw to the Sunshine States.
Speaking of all the consulates, just because I know you're always a busy man, we only have you for a limited time. One of the issues that's before Congress, we'll see what happens, is immigration. To what extent does that apply to Illinois, and how so?
Well, it's huge. I've been one of the co-chairs of the Illinois Coalition for Business and Immigration. This organization's been around about a year and a half now. We are totally committed to trying to get the Congress to fix the broken immigration laws in the U.S. Everybody knows it's broken, now fix it. And obviously there's been some partisanship that gets in the way. It's another one of those examples of what's in the best interest of the country. I see it in many ways, one of which is employment opportunities. Major multinational corporations who are moving people and recruiting people around the world, and they're saying it is a burden. You can't get enough of the H-1B, which is the high tech.
We don't have enough engineers, and we
green
want
cards,
to import
yeah.
them, right?
So the ability to get the workforce that you need. Likewise, the farm community with a legitimate complaint about the inability to get the workforce that they need. In the higher educational institutions, like in the state of Illinois, the University of Illinois, I think, has more international students than any other university in the U.S. And yet, when we graduate them, instead of giving them a green card and saying, why don't you stick around and start a business and employ people and be successful in the U.S., which I think many of them would like to do, we say, well, you've expired, get out of town, get out of Dodge, get out of the United States. That is not the message.
It's a drain brain that we could be tapping into.
That is not the message that we want. So we need to become more employment favorable and comfortable with immigration. Immigration has been with us for generations and generations, and we've got a serious need to fix the existing immigration laws. I'm troubled also by the fact that so many people want to make this an issue just about Mexicans, and that is not the case at all.
That's the image they have.
The image of immigration is it's all about the Rio Grande and the fences. That is so out of line with the real issues that we're needing to deal with. So don't let the emotions get in the way of what makes the United States a great place to live and a great place to work, why we're the envy of the world, and why we should always be seeking the best and the brightest to come here and be successful. So many companies in the U.S. have been created or led by immigrants, and they don't necessarily come from Mexico. They're from all over the world. So don't get caught up in, again, the emotionalism of this issue. Be pragmatic and rational about our needs and the fact that we got a broken system. We send people to Congress to fix things, and we need to encourage them to fix immigration law.
I was going to say, everyone, if they want an image, can look at what a Steve Jobs did, one person, and what flowed from his creativity in creating Apple and all that it has done.
Right.
To the same extent, now we have China is now the #2 economy in the world, and we have a number of Chinese students and Asians that might want to stay here if they were granted the ability to
Well,
stay.
we've long done that, but now we've got serious issues about our long-term future. We have always been a magnet for the entrepreneurial spirit of the world. People come to the United States because they want to better themselves. And people who want to better themselves and their family are the very people who are going to aspire to create a job, to create a business, and to grow and be successful in this country. So I think we are shorting ourselves if we start declining and denying that very talent that frankly makes the country.
How long have you been running the chamber now?
13 years.
And I know you've announced that you're going to be leaving
Right.
at the end of June. It's a fiscal year. Just give us your reflections on what are you proud of accomplishing, and why is now the time for Doug Whitley to be moving on?
We've had a good run despite a very difficult time. I joined the chamber the very week of the unfortunate attack on the World Trade Center in New York. I suffered through the indictment of George Ryan and the indictment of Rod Blagojevich. I suffered through the terrible years of Rod Blagojevich as being a governor who did not want to govern. And now getting out of the economic conditions of the worst recession since the Great Recession. So these have been tough times. Having said that, the Illinois Chamber has led many successful initiatives and many accomplishments, everything from a new tax tribunal in the state of Illinois that people from around the country never thought would have happened in Illinois, revisions of the permitting process at the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, revising and leading changes in the procurement laws after Blagojevich. The General Assembly went way overboard in trying to change the way in which one does business with the state of Illinois, and we've done our best to bring that back. In the early days of the Blagojevich era, we sued the governor over workers' compensation costs that he imposed that were excessive, and fortunately the General Assembly rolled those rates back, and we ultimately did settle that lawsuit in a way that was favorable for business. We've been successful in keeping workers' compensation as a primary public policy issue in this state, which after 20 years of no touching workers' comp, we've now seen it touched twice in the last decade, and I think we will come back and get another run at workers' compensation. And then one of the things I think I'm particularly proud of is that I initiated, founded, and launched the Transportation for Illinois Coalition, which is a statewide coalition that's been around now for almost 13 years, in which I've been successful to bring together lots of disparate organizations, all of whom are committed to infrastructure investment in the state of Illinois, and not limited to roads and bridges, but waterways and airports and rail, to make sure that we move the public. For downstaters to talk about the need for investment in Chicago, and Chicago to talk about the need for investment in downstate opportunities, such as the new Mississippi River Bridge in St. Louis. For road folks to talk about transit, and for transit folks to talk about roads. It is the state as a whole, and this organization, which represents I think about 65 or 70 organizations now statewide, has been true to itself and true to the public for state infrastructure investments, engaging our congressional delegation for congressional investments, whether it's the locks and dams on the Mississippi and Illinois River, or it's modernization of O'Hare Airport, or just sustaining movement of freight rail or trucking through our great state. And it's fundamental, and I feel really proud of the work that's been done by that coalition for a dozen years. Long-term, bipartisan, business, labor, all kinds of interests, all focusing on the same, as we spoke about earlier in the program. It's not a partisan issue. It's about building for the future of our state. I remind people that investing in infrastructure is like planting trees. We don't do it for ourselves. We do it for the long term. And when you talk to engineers and mayors, they will tell you that if they're lucky to get a project in 6 years, that's pretty fast pace. Many of these projects have been around for 20 or 30 years from the time they're perceived until the time that they're built. You have to have a long-term vision when you talk about infrastructure. And yet, that is so fundamental to the state's economy. If you don't take care of your infrastructure today, your kids and grandkids who you want to have jobs and be successful in our great state are not going to be successful in our great state because we failed them, and that's not where we want to be. We want to do for our kids what our parents and grandparents did for us, which was invest in the state of Illinois.
Yeah, I often remind people that our kids go to school on school buses going over bridges that were built by a previous generation.
Right.
We need to be reinvesting, just as you're saying.
Yeah.
Because you can't just build this stuff at the snap of a finger. When you need it, you got to be planning ahead and constantly rebuilding.
Yeah, whether it's a township bridge that has to handle 80,000-pound grain trucks, or a transit bridge in the city of Chicago, if you drive underneath it and you look at the rust and the decay, you say, oh my gosh, at what point is that bridge going to collapse? You can't have that. We don't want to be Minnesota or Washington State. We want to have a healthy, safe, reliable system that will, again, allow businesses to want to be here because it's a transportation hub of the world.
Doug Whitley, we appreciate you taking the time. I know as I said, you're a busy man. You have something you have to go to, but good luck to you in your future, and thanks for your service to Illinois.
Thank you for asking me to be on the show and talk about these very important issues.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.